carriage that carried the Marquis de Sade to his final destination was not the sealed, jolting fourgon of his youth. It was a simpler, more utilitarian vehicle, and the early spring of 1803 offered a feeble light through its grimy window. Inside, the man who was once the most notorious libertine in France was now a bloated, asthmatic relic of 63. His face, once handsome and sharp with aristocratic disdain, was a puffy moon. His small mouth set in a permanent line of bitter resignation. He stared out at the passing countryside, not with the hope of a prisoner nearing release, but with the weary cynicism of one who knew that cages merely changed their shapes. He was being transferred from the brutal St. Pélagie prison to the Hospice de Charenton, an asylum, a madhouse. The irony was not lost on him. For over 30 years, kings and revolutionaries, regimes of every stripe, had locked him away for the crimes of his imagination, for the stories he penned in the dark. Now the new master of France, First Consul Bonaparte, had decreed him officially, legally, insane. It was the final, convenient label for a man whose very existence had become an inconvenient truth. The gates of Charenton swung open. It did not look like the fortresses of Vincennes or the Bastille. It was a collection of stern but clean buildings, some with gardens. There was an air of quiet order, a false peace that Sade immediately distrusted. He was led inside, his movements slow, his breathing a faint wheeze. The air smelled of lye and boiled cabbage, a stark improvement over the fecal stench and rat rot of St. Pélagie, but an institutional smell nonetheless. He was brought before the man who would hold his fate in his hands. Abbé Simon de Coulmier was not what Sade had expected. He was a man in his prime, with a calm, intelligent face and the composed demeanor of a diplomat, not a jailer. He wore the robes of a clergyman, but his eyes held a pragmatic, almost secular kindness. Monsieur de Sade, Coulmier said, his voice even, "You are welcome at Charenton." Sade offered a slight, sardonic bow. "Welcome, Monsieur l'Abbé," or merely deposited. A faint smile touched Coulmier's lips. "That will depend entirely on you. This is not a prison. It is a hospital. Our goal is treatment, not punishment." "A noble sentiment," Sade replied, his voice dripping with a lifetime of scorn for noble sentiments. "And what, pray tell, is the treatment for a man like me? What poultice can you apply to a corrupted soul? What leeches for a polluted mind?" Coulmier was not rattled. "The treatment is order, clean air, occupation, and, God willing, a measure of peace. You will have a room. You may have books, writing materials. You may walk in the gardens. The rules are simple. You will not cause harm to yourself or others, and you will not attempt to escape." Sade almost laughed. Escape? To what? The France he knew was gone, buried under the guillotine's shadow, and resurrected as a military dictatorship. The aristocrats were decimated or exiled. The revolutionaries had devoured each other. The world outside these walls had no place for the Marquis de Sade. In a way, this was the most perfect prison, yet it was one from which he had no desire to flee. His room was simple: a bed, a chair, a desk, a window looking out onto a walled courtyard. It was, by a significant margin, the most humane cell he had occupied in his adult life. As he sat on the edge of the bed, the comparative silence was deafening. It allowed the ghosts to speak. They came to him in the quiet hours. The ghost of his father, a distant, dissolute nobleman; the ghost of his mother, a lady-in-waiting who abandoned the court for a convent. He saw the strict, Jesuitical education that tried to break his spirit, and only succeeded in teaching him the power of dogma to crush the individual. Then came the other ghosts, the more vivid ones. The ghost of Rose Keller, the beggar woman he had whipped at his little house in Arcueil, the scandal that first put his name on the lips of all Paris; the ghost of his beautiful, long-suffering wife, Renée Pélagie, who for years had been his sole link to the outside world, his tireless advocate, bringing him books, fine food, and endless reams of paper to the base of the tower at Vincennes. Her loyalty was a mystery to him, a stubborn, loving reproach to his own monstrous nature. Most of all, he remembered the writing. In the Bastille, in the 11 years before the mob stormed it, he had found his true vocation. Locked in a stone cell, he had discovered a universe of absolute freedom within his own mind. It was there he penned the 120 Days of Sodom, a meticulous, horrific catalogue of every depravity the human animal could conceive. He had written it on a continuous, narrow scroll of paper, pasted together in secret, in a script so tiny it was almost a code. When he was transferred from the Bastille days before its fall, he had been forced to leave the manuscript behind. He had screamed, wept, pounded on the walls of his new cell, not for his lost liberty, but for his lost book. It was, to him, a greater tragedy. The revolution had freed him for a time. He had become Citizen Sade, a revolutionary magistrate. But his conscience, that inconvenient organ, had betrayed him. He had opposed the terror, the endless executions. For this, he was thrown back into prison, this time by the very revolution he had, in his own way, championed. He had narrowly escaped the guillotine himself, a final cosmic joke. Now, here he was, judged insane by a state that itself seemed to have lost its mind. As the dusk settled over Charenton, Donatian Alphonse Francois, Marquis de Sade, smiled a thin, cruel smile. Insane, perhaps, but in this new madness, he sensed an opportunity. Abbé Coulmier was a fool. He offered occupation. He would soon learn what occupation meant to a man like Sade. The following weeks established a routine that was, for Sade, unnervingly tranquil. He was allowed to receive books from a bookseller in Paris. He devoured volumes on history, philosophy, and the latest novels. He was given a steady supply of ink and paper. At his request, Coulmier even provided him with a small, locked box for his private writings. The abbé was true to his word. This was a regime of management, not of torture. Sade and Coulmier began a series of strange, philosophical dialogues. The Marquis, a militant atheist who saw religion as the source of all human misery, and the abbé, a man of God who believed in redemption through good works, were natural antagonists, yet they found a mutual intellectual respect. "You believe in treating these poor wretches with kindness," Abbé Sade said during one of their walks in the garden. "A laudable ambition, but you fail to see the fundamental cruelty of your project." "And what cruelty is that, monsieur?" Coulmier asked, genuinely curious. "You seek to make them fit for society," Sade explained, gesturing with a sweep of his hand at the other patients shuffling in the distance. "You wish to sand down their rough edges, to quiet the strange music in their heads, so they can return to the great, gray, monotonous chorus outside. But what if their madness is their genius? What if the man who believes he is Napoleon is, in the private theater of his mind, happier and more powerful than the real Napoleon will ever be? You are not freeing them. You are training them for a new, more subtle slavery." Coulmier considered this a provocative thought. "But we must live in the world, monsieur. A man who cannot distinguish reality from fantasy is a danger to himself and others. Our duty is to restore that distinction." "Reality," Sade scoffed. "Reality is a consensus agreed upon by the mediocre to protect themselves from the brilliant and the different. I have seen reality. I have seen kings who believed they ruled by divine right have their heads sawn off by a machine. I have seen a republic born in liberty descend into a butcher's yard. Is that the reality you wish to restore these men to? I assure you the fantasies in here," he tapped his own temple, "are often far more rational." Coulmier did not argue further. He saw that for Sade, argument was a form of sustenance. To engage him was to treat him. It was a dangerous game, but Coulmier was a brave man. With his basic comforts secured, Sade returned to his life's work, writing. By day, he composed letters, petitions, and seemingly innocuous historical essays, but by night, or in the hours he was left alone, he unlocked the box and returned to his true voice. He began a new novel, a sprawling, scandalous work he would later call The Days at Florbel. It was a continuation of all his themes: the absolute supremacy of the individual will, the hypocrisy of conventional morality, the pursuit of pleasure as the only rational goal in a godless universe. The very act of writing it here, in an asylum run by a priest, was an act of supreme defiance. Every sentence was a spit in the eye of God, of Napoleon, of Coulmier's benevolent tyranny. He wrote to his wife, Renée Pélagie, who had finally, after decades of suffering, separated from him. His letters were a mix of practical requests for specific books and bitter reproaches. He wrote to his children, who wanted nothing to do with him, their name forever stained by his infamy. He was a patriarch in a dynasty of one, the last and most monstrous of his line. The writing was his sanity and his madness. It was the only space where he was truly, completely free. In the world of his prose, he was a god, creating and destroying characters, orchestrating scenes of limitless depravity and philosophical discourse. The locked box was his mind, and the manuscript within it was the unvarnished, terrifying contents of his soul. Charenton, for all its rules and walls, could not touch him there. It was Coulmier who made the proposal that would transform Sade's final years. The Abbé was a follower of the new, enlightened ideas about mental treatment. He believed that engaging the patients in structured, artistic activities could calm their minds and restore their social faculties. His particular passion was theater. Monsieur de Sade, he said one afternoon, finding the Marquis in the library, I understand you have a great love for the dramatic arts. Sade looked up from his book, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. I have written plays, yes. Before the world decided, I was better suited to being a character in a tragedy than a writer of them. I am starting a new program, Coulmier continued. We will stage plays here at Charenton. The patients will be the actors. I believe it will be therapeutic for them. Sade gave a dry, rattling laugh. You wish to put on a play performed by madmen. My dear Abbé, Paris has the Comédie Française for that. Coulmier ignored the jibe. I want you to direct it. The silence in the library was absolute. Sade stared at the priest, searching for the mockery in his face. There was none. He was serious. You are giving me a company of players, Sade said slowly, the idea beginning to take root in his mind. I am giving you an occupation, a project. You have the knowledge. You have the intelligence. Use it. Help them. Help yourself. At that moment, Donash and de Sade saw it. This was not just an occupation. This was power. This was a stage. It was a world he could create and control. After a lifetime of being acted upon, imprisoned, judged, condemned, he was being offered the director's chair. It was a more potent freedom than any he had found in his writing. This was a freedom to be performed, to be seen. A slow, genuine smile spread across his aged face. It was a smile that had not been seen in many years. Very well, Abbé, he said, his voice regaining a hint of its old, aristocratic authority. Let us put on a show. And so, the theater of Charenton was born. Coulmier had a small stage constructed in one of the halls. The rehearsals were a form of beautiful, controlled chaos. Sade, who had spent his life obsessed with the mechanics of power and the performance of desire, was a natural, if tyrannical, director. He worked with a cast drawn from the asylum's inmates, a melancholic lawyer who believed he was Cicero, a former soldier haunted by phantom battles, a young woman who would lapse into catatonic stillness if not constantly engaged. Sade displayed a patience and an insight that surprised even Coulmier. He knew how to coax a performance out of the most shattered psyche, how to channel their delusions into the structured artifice of a role. "No, no, no," he would cry, striding onto the stage, his asthma forgotten in his passion. "You are not a madman pretending to be a king. You are the king, and this fool," he pointed at another actor, "is a traitorous duke. The fury you feel is real. Use it. Let the world see your majesty." He found that the inmates, unburdened by the conventions of professional actors, often delivered performances of raw, shocking power. They weren't acting, they were being, but within a frame he provided. He was the puppeteer of their souls, and they, in turn, gave life to his visions. He adapted plays, wrote new scenes, and orchestrated elaborate tableaus for a few hours each day. The Madhouse was not a place of confinement, but a crucible of creation. The line between therapy and exploitation, between genius and madness, became impossibly blurred. Sade was, for the first time, not just a writer, but a creator of living, breathing art. He was free. The news of this bizarre experiment could not be contained. Parisian society, always hungry for novelty and scandal, began to whisper. Soon, carriages from the city started to appear at Charenton on performance days. The elite of the Napoleonic era, bejeweled ladies, dashing officers, cynical politicians, came to see the spectacle. The infamous Marquis de Sade directing his cast of lunatics. They sat in the small auditorium, a mixture of revulsion and fascination on their faces as the stage became a mirror. Was this a play, or was it a window into the asylum? Were the actors performing, or were they simply being themselves? And who, truly, was the audience? The fashionable Parisians watching the madmen, or the madmen in their heightened reality, observing the follies of the so-called sane? The plays were a triumph, a scandalous, controversial triumph. Coulmier was initially pleased. His therapeutic experiment was a success, and it brought a certain prestige to his asylum. But Sade pushed further. His plays began to include veiled, and then not so veiled, critiques of the new emperor, Napoleon. The dialogue he wrote for his actors crackled with subversive wit, attacking the very foundations of the state, the church, and the family. The stage at Charenton became the most dangerous theater in France. Inevitably, the authorities took notice. The new, rigidly conservative climate of the empire would not tolerate such a circus, especially one run by a man known as a monster of depravity. The state decided to intervene. The instrument of its will was a man named Dr. Athanase Royer-Collard. Royer-Collard was everything Coulmier was not. Where the abbé was humane and progressive, the doctor was cold and scientific. He represented a new school of thought in psychiatry that viewed madness not as a spiritual or moral affliction to be soothed, but as a physiological disease to be controlled, dominated, and crushed. He was appointed as the chief physician at Charenton, with the explicit mission to bring order. His arrival was like a cold front. He inspected the asylum with a sneer of disapproval. He saw Coulmier's methods as weak, sentimental, and dangerous. And he saw Sade not as a patient, but as the corrupting core of the rot. His first meeting with Coulmier was a declaration of war. "This theater is an abomination," Royer Collard stated, his voice like the scraping of a blade on stone. "It perverts the patience, mocks public decency, and provides a platform for a degenerate. It must cease immediately." Coulmier fought back. "The theater is a vital part of their treatment, doctor. It provides them with purpose, discipline, and a means of expression. Monsieur de Sade has been instrumental in its success." "Monsieur de Sade," Royer Collard interrupted, "is the reason this institution is a laughingstock. He is not mad. He is evil, and his evil is contagious. You have given a venomous serpent a nest in which to breed. That ends now." One by one, Sade's hard-won freedoms were stripped away. Royer Collard's edicts descended like axes. The theater was shut down. The scripts were confiscated. Sade's writing materials were severely restricted. His walks were supervised and shortened. His contact with the other inmates was forbidden. The locked box containing his manuscript for the days at Florbel was taken from him. The door to his room, which had often been left open, was now locked from the outside. The world Sade had built within the madhouse crumbled. He was thrown back into a deeper, more profound isolation than he had known even in the Bastille. This time, the loss was more acute because he had tasted a different kind of life. He had known the thrill of command, the joy of creation, the heady drug of an audience. Now, it is all gone. He retreated entirely into the last fortress that remained to him, his own mind. He would sit for hours in his chair, staring at the wall, his body present, but his spirit far away. He composed elaborate fantasies in his head, entire novels he could no longer write down. He held conversations with the phantoms of his past. The man who had sought to experience every extreme of physical sensation was now reduced to a purely cerebral existence. The final, bitter paradox was upon him. The state, in its attempt to crush his spirit, had forced him into the only realm where he was truly, utterly, and absolutely free. The boundless, unconquerable landscape of his own imagination. In his final years, a small, tragic connection flickered to life. A young woman named Madeleine Leclerc, the daughter of an employee at the asylum, began to visit him. She was 16, innocent, and for reasons no one could understand, felt a pity for the old, broken man. She would bring him little treats, talk to him, and help him with small tasks. It was a relationship of profound inequality and strange tenderness. For Sade, it was a glimpse of a humanity he had spent his life denying. For Madeleine, it was a dangerous fascination with the abyss. His health, always precarious, declined rapidly. The asthma tightened its grip on his chest. Gout swelled his joints. He became a ghost of his already spectral self. On a cold December day in 1814, as a light snow fell on the walls of Charenton, Donation Alphonse Francois, Marquis de Sade, drew his last, wheezing breath. He was 74 years old. He had spent 32 of his last 42 years in captivity. His final wishes were ignored. In his will, he had demanded that his body be buried in an unmarked grave on his property, with acorns sown over it so that the spot would be forever lost, and his memory, as of the tomb, vanish from the face of the earth. It was his last grand gesture of negation, but the authorities wanted no shrine, no pilgrimage site for degenerates. He was buried in the cemetery of the Charenton asylum. The ceremony was perfunctory, attended only by the necessary officials, and in a final, fitting act of obliteration, Abbé Coulmier, perhaps to protect the asylum, or to honor the state's wishes, ordered the burning of Sade's final, unpublished manuscripts, including the massive The Days at Florbel, the last fruits of his imagination, the ultimate expressions of his freedom, were consumed by fire, their ashes mingling with the cold, indifferent air of the madhouse that had been his last, most paradoxical kingdom. The man who had screamed for absolute liberty in the physical world had found his only lasting, unassailable freedom not in the boudoirs of Paris or the cells of the Bastille, but within the confines of the madhouse, on a stage of his own making. And finally, in the silent, inviolable theater of his mind, the Marquis de Sade was gone, but the echo of his question, the demand for the right to one's own darkest imaginings, would linger long after the walls of Charenton had turned to dust.